Thank you all for coming. I'm Cliff Fox. And, I thought in retrospect that probably you have no idea what this lecture is about. So, and perhaps we should have said more in the message than just the title, Princess Alice, which is not very informative, I suppose. The topic itself was actually suggested to me. It's a very interesting one. But let me, this is Princess Alice. This is the woman that I'm going to talk about. You probably have never heard of her. So, first of all, her birth name, she was Alice, Princess of Battenberg. Her married name, and she was married in 1903 when she was 18. Alice, Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark. Now, that may be a little strange, but in some of these royal families, when a woman marries, if her husband is, Prince Andrew, she becomes Princess Andrew, which sounds fairly strange to us. In the British royal family, they usually avoid this by giving a prince some sort of title when he gets married, so that his wife can then be a duchess or a countess or something and not just be a princess with his name attached. Okay. Because it just sounds a little silly, but that is the official form, and these are the names. And of course, she is princess of both Greece and Denmark, which may sound a little odd, but we shall get to that in a moment. So why is she significant? Well, let's start with something very simple. Her son, her youngest child, is Prince Philip, the consort of Queen Elizabeth II. So that itself is something that might suggest her position within the European royalty. Interesting that she was born congenitally deaf. And indeed, although I'm not going to do this, you can just do the whole lecture from the viewpoint of her coping with deafness. Okay, she, of course, when she was a child, there isn't much technology available at that time, but she learned sign language and she learned to read lips. Although we'll find out that there were times in her life when her deafness allowed her to pretend she didn't understand things when that was probably convenient. We'll get back to that when we get to some of the other features of her life. Now, she married Princess Andrew of Greece and Denmark in 1903. And much of her life is really involved in the ins and outs of Greek politics. In some ways, the politics of modern Greece is very much like the politics of any Eastern European country, which is convoluted. And certainly that's the case here. And we'll talk about some of these ins and outs of all of that. I suppose that's kind of, I'm very interested in Eastern European politics and the role of ethnicity in Eastern European politics. So I'm probably going to talk more about that than anything else. Her life was in many ways very troubled. In 1930, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She spent time in a sanatorium in Switzerland. And she also never again lived with her husband. Now, there are a couple of things about this account which don't quite make sense. People don't suddenly have schizophrenia and then recover in terms of modern understandings of what this is. So I assume she had some sort of psychotic disorder, certainly, but it was not a lifelong affliction as schizophrenia is. And moreover, she was 45 at this onset, which is kind of odd for schizophrenia, which generally manifests itself younger. So they called it schizophrenia. Whether a modern psychiatrist would is a whole other question. And of course, none of the kind of modern drugs and other treatments available for this disorder existed in her time. But certainly her mental condition was a pretty frail circumstance. As to her marriage, well, that's kind of story itself. It's generally believed that Prince Andrew, her husband, was probably gay. That he got married and had children because that's what a prince is supposed to do. But they had, in fact, 5 children, which was a lot of what a prince was supposed to do. And so they went their separate ways. By then, of course, the family was completed. There weren't going to be any more children, and so on. But much about the details of their personal lives we simply are never going to know, as with anyone else's personal life. Now, she spent most of her life after her recovery. She went to live in Athens, and this is interesting in that because of her connection, she could have gone to live in England and would have been accepted as a royal in England. She could have gone to live all sorts of places, but she chose to spend the rest of her life in Greece, her adopted homeland. Despite the fact her marriage wasn't exactly happy. She fell in love with Greece. When she married, she converted to the Greek Orthodox Church. She became devoted to the church. And indeed, she would spend much of her life in charity work on behalf of the church. Now, of course, a very famous episode in her life was that during the Second World War, here she was, a princess living in downtown Athens, kitty corner from Gestapo headquarters, and she was hiding Jews in her house. This is probably the single thing about her which is most famous, and she has been honored in Israel at the Vad Vashem Holocaust Memorial as one of the righteous of the Gentiles, non-Jews, who risked their lives to protect Jews during the Holocaust. So she did that. And I'll say more about that, of course, as we move along. After the World War, she founded an order of nuns, which still continues today, and increasingly lived a devout life. In 1967, in Greece, there was a coup. The military shut down the democracy, the democratic parliament of Greece, and also drove the king into exile. And at that point, she left Greece. And she was invited to live in Buckingham Palace with her son-in-law and daughter, and with her son and daughter-in-law. And there she spent the last 2 years of her life until her death in 1969. She was really buried in Britain, but in 1988 her remains were moved to the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, where she still lies. So she lived a very crowded and complicated life. It's an interesting life. In many ways, a princess. She was a privileged person, of course, but it was a privilege which came with many burdens, and she was acutely aware of this. And I think this sense of the burden of her position really is central to her life and to how she saw herself. And no doubt her physical handicap as a deaf person tended to accentuate this feeling of the burden of her position. So let's go back now. Now that you got an idea of who we're talking about and some of the highlights of this, let me go back and say more about her, because you really can't ever know about someone who is, after all, a princess without a look at her ancestry. Now, her father, Louis, Prince of Battenberg, was German by birth. And one of the problems is, although he was a Prince of Battenberg, there was no Principality of Battenberg. The title Prince of Battenberg had kind of been invented for him and his brothers because his father, a prince of the House of Hesse, had married a woman whom his father thought was beneath him. And there was a tradition among many European royal houses of what they called morganatic marriages, where if a man married below his station, he might be grudgingly allowed to marry, but his wife would not be accepted as a member of the family. And his children could not even use their surname. So we'd have to invent a name for them. Okay? Just to give an example, one of the most famous in the 20th century was, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, assassinated Sarajevo, the killing started World War I. He was in a morganatic marriage because his wife was a mere countess, which his imperial family thought to be beneath him. And so she was not allowed to share any of his royal titles, and his children were not allowed to bear the Habsburg family name. They invented the name Hohenberg for them. Okay. So this is something that happened, and it was kind of common in the 19th, early 20th century because, there's just more social contact between royals and somewhat more ordinary people, and thus a higher instance of these kind of marriages. And of course, in earlier centuries, if you were a prince and you met some common woman, you just made her a mistress. You didn't worry about the whole marriage thing. Okay? But modern people who want to do the decent thing don't necessarily want to do that. Okay? So that's the origins of the Battenberg family. Now, Louis spent most of his life as an officer in the British Navy. And he would eventually rise to the rank of Admiral of the Fleet. And this means, of course, that Alice is mostly British in terms of her upbringing. She lived at different places where her father was stationed during periods when he, for example, was assigned to the Mediterranean Fleet. Alice spent part of her childhood on the island of Malta, the island in the middle of the Mediterranean, which was, of course, a headquarters for the fleet. By the way, her father, important point about him, in 1914, he was the first Sea Lord, that is, the head of the British Navy. And there was much criticism of him in the press because, after all, he was a German. How can we allow a German to run the British Navy in a war with Germany? And eventually he will be fired, rather unjustly, as many in the government agreed, because of his German connection. And in fact, of course, one of the oddities was that the British royal family was itself German. Right? At the start of World War I, the king, George V, his family name is Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which is Tripoli German. And in 1917, under pressure, the king will invent the new family name Windsor. It's about as English as you can get. Okay. Prince Battenberg gets fired, for basically being a German. And he too, his family is pressured into taking a new surname. They go from being Battenberg to being Mountbatten. Alice, by now, of course, is married. She's a married woman. She isn't really affected by the name change. But certainly she was alarmed by the way her father was treated. We'll come back to the First World War here again. Now, one thing that is really interesting is that her mother, a princess of the House of Hesse in Germany, her mother, Alice, after whom this Alice is named, she's named after her grandmother. And that grandmother, Alice, is, of course, a daughter of Queen Victoria and Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. Really more Germans when you get right down to it. Okay? So she is a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. And otherwise, she knows Victoria. She is 16 when Victoria dies. So this is not just some theoretical relationship that you see in a genealogical chart. She knows Queen Victoria, and since her father is in the British Navy and they're really living in Britain most of the time, she is a regular member of the royal family's circle. She sees the Queen at family gatherings and so on. So she's very much, in that sense, a British royal. And that's an important part of her identity. Now here are, this is her father and mother. There is the Admiral. Her mother named Victoria, one of the inevitable names in this kind of period. Again, her mother is a daughter of Queen Victoria, so she's named after her grandmother. Okay? And here, of course, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Albert died relatively young, only about 42 years old. Victoria dressed in black for the rest of her life. She really did love Albert. She did get a little obsessive about it all, I must say. Now, let's talk about her marriage. Andrew, Prince of Greece and Denmark. First of all, how do you get to be Prince of Greece and Denmark? Greece had become an independent country in the early 19th century after rebellion against the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Now, this was a rebellion which had been hugely popular and a real emotional attachment in Western Europe and in this country as well. Okay. Now, the Greek rebels had wanted to form they used the Greek word demokratia. In fact, one of the impacts in this country, people don't realize this, is before 1820, almost nobody in mainstream American politics wants to be called a Democrat.
Very good idea.
After 1820, suddenly it is the Greeks that make that word fashionable in America. And you start seeing people are now proud to be Democrats in the 1820s, not before. Greeks are actually very responsible for this. You see in America the number of towns that get named after Greek people and places. Now, where I used to live in Michigan, there's a town in Michigan called Ypsilanti. You go, what on earth is a Ypsilanti? Well, Alexander Ypsilanti was the first leader of the Greek rebellion against the Turks. And people out on the frontier of Michigan named their town in his honor. The cachet of this, very famously, if you know a little about English literature, Lord Byron went to volunteer to fight for the Greeks and died there of disease. Now, the Greek rebels had wanted to have a republic, a demokratia. Eventually, they're able to win their independence of Greece because of the intervention of the major European powers. The British, the French, the Russians all deployed their fleets and told the Turks to go away. The Turks didn't have much choice. But the British, the French, and the Russians also agreed that the Greeks could not have a republic. They would have to have a monarchy, and the great powers would decide who was an acceptable monarch. And the Greeks were basically told that if they didn't accept these terms, they'd be left out to dry. And good luck with the Turks. So they took this. The first king they stuck into the place was a German prince, well, that's almost inevitable. The Greeks hated him, and there was later a revolution to drive him out. He was then replaced by a Dane, who was heavily supported by the British. In fact, this Dane's sister was married to the Prince of Wales, Victoria's son, who later becomes King Edward VII. Confused?
Yes.
All these people are marrying each other. That's what they do. That's what royals do. Like I said, what other purpose do royals really have but getting married and having kids? So that's how you can be Prince of Greece and Denmark. Now, Prince Andrew, whom Alice married, was the son of King George I of Greece. And it's important to realize, as I said, this Danish family were very much supported by the British. And the Russians were rather teed off at this. And so how do you make the Russians feel better? How? Look, who does George I marry? Right? A Grand Duchess of Russia, a member of the Russian imperial family. That's how you make them feel better. It's all a family business. Okay? And of course, she, in turn, if you look at the two grandfathers, George I, of course, he's the son of the King of Denmark. And Olga, she is a granddaughter of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. Now keep in mind, if you were a Greek, how would you feel about this? I don't think you'd necessarily be very happy about this. You may be grateful that the great European powers support Greek independence and help keep the Turks off your back. But do you really like the great European powers deciding what form of government you can have and who your king's going to be? I think you'd feel pretty put out by this. Okay, so that's important background to understanding the life of this woman. Now that's her husband. That's Prince Andrew. And there is a picture of her father-in-law, King George. Let's get you an idea of who these folks are. Now, just to get ahead of the story, she and Andrew will have 5 children. First of all, there are 4 daughters. Each of them will grow up to marry a German nobleman. Okay? By the way, when Princess Alice is hiding a family of Jews in her home, 3 of her sons-in-law are German officers, 2 of them in the SS. This is one way that she's getting away with this whole thing. Her youngest child and only son is Philip, born in 1921, and who will eventually, of course, marry Elizabeth. In his life in Britain, he will use the English form of that name, of his mother's family name, Mountbatten. And eventually, when he becomes a British subject, he officially, legally takes Mountbatten as his surname. I should note that when he goes to live in Britain, his almost sort of his surrogate father is one of his mother's brothers, Louis Mountbatten. Later in World War II, the Supreme Allied Commander for Southeast Asia, and after World War II, the last British Viceroy in India. So again, you can see her entanglement with all of these very important figures and events really spread out all over the world. Here's Prince Philip. This is his picture with Elizabeth. And another picture of him in his naval uniform. Both of these relatively young pictures. Now, so let me tell you about what happens to Alice. She's married in 1903, moves to Greece with her husband. The first great crisis that's going to hit her politically is during World War I. Her father-in-law, King George, has no interest in having Greece enter the war. This is a position that her husband shares. And of course, it's not entirely clear what she really feels about this. After all, her family is British, her father's a British admiral. But certainly they want to keep Greece out of the war. And the ugly news of what the war is like certainly doesn't change their mind about that. But Greece has an elected parliament. And the Prime Minister of Greece is Eleftherios Venizelos. Now, he's generally considered the great statesman of 20th century Greece. If you fly to Athens, by the way, you will land at Venizelos Airport. Okay. Actually, my wife and I landed at Venizelos Airport like 2 days after it opened. The most memorable thing was that the computer running the luggage system had collapsed, and they couldn't find our bags. But anyway, so try not to land at major airports 2 days after they open. Everything will be screwed up. Anyhow, now what Venizelos believed, now it's important to keep in mind that we think of Greece as this sort of small country. But there are ethnic Greeks living in other places. And notably, there were ethnic Greeks living in what is now Turkey, what was then the Ottoman Empire. And certainly many Greeks still thought of Constantinople or Istanbul as a Greek city. So Venizelos and other Greeks wanted Greece to enter the First World War. As soon as the Ottoman Turks entered the war on the German side. Why? Because then when the Ottoman Empire is defeated, it can be carved up like a roast. And Greece can get back Constantinople and all the parts of Anatolia, that is the Turkish mainland, where Greeks are the majority. This was known in Greece. They call this the big idea. This was the big idea. Okay? King George I was no fan of the big idea. But he was overthrown in 1917 and driven out of the country. And Alice and Andrew leave the country as well. During this exile, by the way, is when Prince Philip was born. Now, interestingly, during this time, there are, let me switch to a map here. This is maybe a little hard to visualize. I'm going to switch over to this map. There we go. Here is Greece. These islands over here, notice the Ionian Islands, which are today part of Greece. At that time, they were not part of Greece. They were a British possession. So when Alice and Andrew were driven out of Greece, they stayed as possibly close as they could while still having the safety of the British flag. And Prince Philip was born on the island of Corfu, which is one of the Ionian Islands. Okay? Today, a real playground of the rich. But in some way it always was. But this is, so they don't go far, because they certainly want to go back. Now, the Greeks go into the war, and although there are certainly terrible losses, they do wind up on the right side. The Ottomans are defeated. But it keeps on getting more and more complicated. Now, first of all, when King George I was driven into exile, they stuck his brother on the throne as a figurehead. When the brother dies in 1920, they invite George to come back, because after all, what's done is done. And not only that, but it's getting more complicated, because see, the Ottoman Empire has disintegrated. And the problem is that in Anatolia, there is now this new Turkish Republic being formed. And the Turkish Republic is a very nationalistic republic. So now suddenly even people who had thought going to the war was a bad idea suddenly think, well, we have to protect the ethnic Greeks of Anatolia from becoming a beleaguered minority under Turkish rule. So even someone like Andrew, who would oppose the big idea, suddenly thinks something's got to be done to save the Greeks in Anatolia. This, alas, leads the Greeks into a war against Turkey, where they get thoroughly pummeled. It's a disaster for the Greeks. Andrew is an army commander, and when it's all over, he is blamed for the defeat, and I think quite unfairly, and he's basically exiled again. So you can see this is a pretty unhappy kind of situation. More than that, many people in Greece blame the whole royal business for all their problems, and they decide to create a republic and get rid of the whole royal family entirely. Now, I want to point out something else about this that's rather curious. Now, these are the two great adversaries of the Greek-Turkish rivalry. Over here, Venizelos, and over there, the man who will eventually become known as Kemal Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey. Now, they finally signed a peace treaty in 1923. Okay, and the Greeks must give up any claim to any land on Anatolia. But now here's the funny thing. Venizelos and Ataturk agreed to something else. Something that today I think no one would think was very acceptable, at least not under international law. They agreed to a swap of populations. Every ethnic Greek in Anatolia will have to leave and move to Greece. And every ethnic Greek, a Turk in Greece, will have to move to Anatolia. A forcible population exchange. Few problems. First of all, awful lot of people are actually bilingual. They speak Greek and Turkish equally well. Okay? A lot of these people have exactly the same customs. Okay? Try going to a Greek restaurant and then go to a Turkish restaurant and tell me what the difference is. Well, everything is called different things, but it's the same food. Okay? So the problem is, if you're wandering around, you're an army officer, and you say, find out where the Greeks are so we can move them out. Suddenly, you can't find any. Everybody speaks Turkish. Everybody gives you a Turkish name. What do? Because nobody wants to be forcibly relocated. So here's the funny thing. Venizelos and Ataturk have one thing in common. They are both really hostile to organized religion. They really can't stand organized religion. Right? But they decide that the definition of what it to be a Turk is to be a Muslim, and to be a Greek is to go to the Orthodox Church. You see, you can speak two languages, right? But you really can't have two religions. So everyone in Anatolia who is Orthodox Christian, Greek Orthodox, 2.5 million people are forcibly moved out. And about 500,000 Muslims are moved out from Greece. Now here's the other problem. This is an unequal exchange. And not only that, but many of these Greeks on Anatolia, they are farmers. Does Greece have a lot of farmland to spare? No, it's not. It's a small country, and it's mostly hillsides. Okay? Greek agriculture mostly consists of things you can grow on hillsides, like grapes. You can grow on a hillside. Olive trees, you grow on a hillside. Wheat, good luck. Okay. Now, the 500,000 Muslims kicked out of Greece, they're better off because they can, they can pick the best of the lands vacated by all those Greeks because there are more of them. You know what happens with the Greeks is 2.5 million Greeks get dumped. There's the port of Athens, Piraeus. Before the 1920s, Piraeus was just a small town. I mean, it was just a place for things to be dumped to go to Athens. That's it. Piraeus soon becomes a huge city, as it is today. And it starts out as essentially a giant refugee camp. And let me tell you, it's not much better now. Huh? It is a very poor, ramshackle kind of town. And many of the families dumped there in the 1920s, the families are still there. And every movement in Greek politics which is radical, whether it's the Greek Communist Party, or there is in Greece now a problem with this sort of neo-fascist movement called the Golden Dawn. Piraeus, it's always Piraeus. That's where everyone who is angry and crazy in Greek politics goes. Because this community, they were screwed. And they were dumped. And it's never been made right. And I don't really know how the Greeks can make it right when you come right down to it. Okay? But it's a very big deal. And of course, if you blame the royal family for all of this, okay, then you want them to go away. Now, a lot of the people who established this Greek Republic in 1924 don't think they're Democrats. They're admirers of Benito Mussolini. Okay? What they really don't like about the royal family is the royal family, they're kind of, they believe in kind of British-style parliamentary democracy. that will not make Greece a great nation. Okay, there's this fanatical element in here. So this is the kind of issues that Princess Alice is dealing with. And of course, it is during this very time that she is diagnosed with schizophrenia. Okay? You got to think about, what is the stress she's under personally? How many different identities is she being asked to juggle? On top of her physical problems as a deaf person. Right? That can't have made it any better. Okay? Now, in 1935, the monarchy is restored. The fact is that the military government is kind of shown the door by the Great Depression, right? They can't solve the economic problems, let's get rid of them. And so here we have the military is out, this is back in. She comes back in, but lo and behold, there's now a monarchy, but within a year, there's another military coup led by Ioannis Metaxas. Of course, these kind of governments are all over Europe. You have military or fascist governments. And then Metaxas dies just right before the German invasion. When a dictator might have actually been of some use, he's suddenly dead. He might have at least given the country some sort of defense. Here is Metaxas, and here is General Papagos, who is kind of left holding the bag when Metaxas dies and is defeated by the Germans. So Alice is living in Athens, and she stays there. In spite of pleas from her British cousins to get out, she stays. Now, Greece went through a terrible ordeal under the German occupation. A lot of Greeks died of starvation. There was rampant disease. But I want to turn to the question of the Holocaust in Greece, the destruction of Greece's Jewish community of about 85,000 people. Now, the biggest Jewish community in Greece was not in Athens, but in the northern Greek city of Thessalonica, which had some 50,000 Jews. Now, Greek Jews were a rather mixed bag. There was an ancient community of Greek-speaking Jews who'd been there for, since the Roman Empire, and they were known as Romaniotes. Precisely because they'd been there since the Roman Empire and they'd always spoken Greek. In addition, when Jews had been driven out of Spain at the end of the 15th century, quite a few Spanish Jews, Sephardim, moved to the Ottoman Empire, which was very tolerant. So plenty of Thessalonica Jews are Sephardim. They speak Spanish. And of course, there's also some Central and Eastern European Jews, so-called Ashkenazim, who've come as well. But they've mostly come later in the game here. Now, the primate of the Orthodox Church in Greece, Archbishop Damaskinos, urges every priest in Greece, if you know any Jews, fake baptismal certificates for them. Now, he doesn't quite order this, because he realizes if you're a priest and you're faking baptismal certificates for Jews, you get caught, you're going to get shot. So he doesn't quite want to order them to do this, because he thinks he should urge them to do it. He himself does this, even though his palace, by the way, is across the street from Princess Alice and kitty corner from the Gestapo headquarters. How do you sneak people in and out when the Gestapo are down the street? But he did. And he is also honored as one of the righteous of the Gentiles. That's the archbishop over there. This is a picture of a couple of these are Jews from Thessalonica wearing their traditional garb. Okay. A lot of them haven't yet switched to modern European clothing yet. It still looks very, very pre-modern, really very Ottoman. You come right down to it. Very much like the Turks had dressed earlier. Now, what does Princess Alice do? She hides members of a Jewish family that she knows very well. Hamaki Cohen was a former member of the Greek Parliament and a prominent businessman. And he had been a key player in the attempt to keep Greece out of World War I. It failed, but he had been important in this. He was a big supporter of King George back in those days. Now he dies, and he leaves a widow, a daughter, and 4 sons. Now eventually the 3 oldest sons, they are smuggled out of Greece, and they join the Allied forces. There's a Greek government in exile in Egypt. Okay? But his widow, his daughter, and his youngest son are hidden in Alice's house. The son is eventually smuggled out and also joins the Allied forces. But the widow and the daughter stay in her house for the rest of the war. The mother is disguised, is supposedly a tutor, a teacher, and the daughter is disguised as a maid. Now, the Gestapo was rather suspicious of Princess Alice and came to interview her a number of times. They were pretty deferential, at least by Gestapo standards, since she was a princess, and she did have sons-in-law in the SS. And it was very good for her that, being deaf, she could always pretend not to understand the question. Okay. And in fact, they generally left completely confused by her answers, but attributed it to her disability. And they tend to think that, oh, she must be harmless, right? She's this harmless deaf person. They don't take her seriously. And this may have saved her as much as anything else. By the way, she never said anything about this. It was after the war, the Cohens publicized the story of her actions because they wanted to express their gratitude. This is a picture. This is old King George. And there are the Cohens up there. This was taken before the war. King George would sometimes go up to the Cohens' estate to have a vacation. Now, I should add that during the war, there's a lot of resistance activity in Greece, but alas, there are 2 resistance movements, and they hate each other. And they often spend more time fighting each other and ratting on each other to the Germans than cooperating. There is, first of all, a communist-affiliated National Liberation Front, and then there's the so-called National Republican Greek League. Now keep in mind, this is Republican. These are these hard right-wing sort of fascist nationalists. See, nobody really likes the royal family very much. Right? At least no one who wants to fight likes the royal family much. So it's a pretty uncomfortable circumstance. Now, at the end of the war, the Germans actually just kind of leave. When the Soviets come smashing through Eastern Europe, the whole German army in Greece is pulled out to try to plug the gap somewhere further north. The British rush in a force to at least occupy Athens very quickly. And it's very clear the British interest is in restoring the royal family. And this, of course, included making sure that Alice was safe. Archbishop Damaskinos is installed as regent of a temporary government, but alas, there is very soon civil war. Interestingly, the two main figures of this war on the left is the leader of the Greek Communist Party, Nikos Zachariadis. And in 1947, President Truman sends General James Van Fleet to be the principal military advisor to the Greek government. And he is the de facto commander of the Greek forces in the Greek Civil War. This is a real turning point in American history. As you know, we often say that the Cold War begins with the so-called Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was issued to justify American involvement in the Greek Civil War. So this is a pretty important kind of episode. Now, Alice herself becomes very much involved in a lot of the rebuilding activity after the war. This is when she founds her order of monks. She is the Mother Superior. She becomes a very popular figure until, of course, the military overthrow the government in 1967. And then, of course, she moved on to her death in London and essentially later her burial in Jerusalem. She is, by the way, buried next to an aunt of hers who had married into the Russian royal family and has since been canonized as a saint by the Orthodox Church for her charity activities. So, and indeed, this is where she wanted to be buried, next to her aunt, whom she much admired. And I will leave the last word for her. I love this story. When her daughter, Sophia, Princess George of Hanover, complained she'd be too far away for them to visit her grave. They didn't want her buried in Jerusalem. It's too far away. She replied, nonsense. There's a perfectly good bus service. I think she was putting one over on her. Well, I'm sure she saw her children as a little pretentious, to say the least. You can see there a picture of her in her later years in her nun's habit. Clearly very jovial expression, and there on the left is the memorial to her in Vad Yashem in Jerusalem. And that is my presentation. So thank you for listening. Hope you found this interesting. Any questions?
Was the Regent Damaskinos the same guy that baptized the Jews?
Yes. He was the primate of the Greek Orthodox Church in Greece.
How do you put that? Kinios?
Damaskinos. He was the patriarch. Well, he wasn't the patriarch. That's complicated. He was the primate of the Greek Orthodox, of the Church of Greece. That is, his jurisdiction only ran to the territory of Greece. So he's not a patriarch. That gets complicated, right? Because the patriarch lives in Constantinople, Istanbul. But yes, he's the same person. And so, and of course, in some ways, the monarchy survived as long as it did because of him and because of the support of both Britain and the U.S. Because otherwise, without the royal family, so Greece was too sharply divided between the far left and the far right.
Civil War.
Well, there's civil war anyway. But in the longer term, even if you can end the civil war by crushing your enemies, it doesn't solve the problem of creating a viable society. And they saw the royal family as the only connecting tissue that there really was to knit Greece together. It's ironic since the royal family itself in the past been a source of division, but they saw him as the only the only unifying force between a country really paralyzed between communists on the one side and these ultra nationalists who really fascists in many ways. How do you build any sort of consensus in the middle?
Wait, how much Greek population is there in Istanbul? Is there very much?
Oh, aren't many left. There were riots in the 1950s in which most of the remaining Greeks were driven out. There are a few Greeks left in Constantinople, but most of the only remaining functioning Greek Orthodox churches in Istanbul, actually, if you go there on Sunday, they're filled with Greek Americans who've come as tourists,
Sure.
right? That's for them mostly. There were hardly any real Greeks left in Istanbul. There are some. There's a few Aegean islands that belong to Turkey that are still largely Greek, but really there's not much left of the Greek community in Turkey. And in fact, one of the problems they have is the Turks say that anyone elected as ecumenical patriarch must be a Turkish citizen. So the current ecumenical patriarch, Bartholomeus, he is a Turkish citizen. He was born on one of these islands. He did his military service in the Greek army, and the Turkish army, that must have been a thrill. He's also went to seminary and so on. He's an interesting character, the current ecumenical patriarch. Very interesting character. He became quite close friends with Pope John Paul II.
What is his name?
Well, Bartholomew. That would be the closest English rendition of the name. He's a very interesting character. He really is. He became very close with Pope John Paul II. They used to meet 3-4 times a year.
You ought to give a talk on him sometime.
Yeah. Well, he'd be worth something. And he's apparently developed a relationship with Pope Francis. He pops into Rome all the time. It's a very interesting character, and of course he has a very good relationship with the Greek Americans. Of course, Greek Americans pay for, the ecumenical patriarch can really exist because Greek Americans support it. Otherwise, the ecumenical patriarch would be, living in a cellar somewhere, right? So, and in fact, people have said that if things get worse in Turkey, and now there's a more Islamic government, so that may happen, don't be surprised if the ecumenical patriarch doesn't move to New York.
Yeah, because it's getting bad in Turkey.
Right, and so, and that's what they would do. He would just move to New York. They've pretty much already said that. Most of the money supporting him is from New York anyway. So that is a possibility. It would be, they've been there for, 600 years. So they're not going to be real thrilled to move. But at some point, the seminary has been shut now for 30 years. They can't train any more priests. Right? They got to send priests here. They send Greeks go to the seminary up in Brookline, Massachusetts. There's a seminary. That's where the Turks train their. The Turks don't want them to send Turks to go to Greece to their seminaries.
No,
because Greece is like so they go to an American Greek Orthodox seminary, of which we have several in this country, and the Turks kind of can live with that. But how long, you can really have a functioning church on this basis? I don't know. So, and it much depends, of course, on what happens in Turkish politics. You know. But by the way, Ataturk was not tolerant of the Greek Orthodox. Famous story about that in Izmir, 1922. Ataturk decided to drive all the Greeks out and to basically burn the city down and burn them out, force them out. He was lectured to by the Muslim ulema that this was wrong. It was contrary to Muslim law. They had an excellent relationship in that city with the Greek Orthodox and also with the rabbis, and they had been running the city together and solving problems for centuries. So, you know, Ataturk was no treat for them either, but not on religious grounds, but on ethnic grounds, because they weren't Turks. The same thing, the riots in Constantinople in the 1950s. They were not religious riots. They were ethnic riots. Okay. So, you know, Islam as such has not really been that hostile. It's the national, but they can become mutually reinforcing, and that's a very dangerous combination. But the clergy alone, if it's clergy to clergy, there is a history of quite a bit of cooperation, really. But when the politics gets mixed in, of course, that all goes out.
That in Lebanon, it used to have,
Absolutely.
It used to have
That's
a lot of cooperation between the
Right.
the way Lebanon functioned.
That's right. The old brokered state. Exactly.
Thank you, Clifton.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Very interesting.